Death at Dewberry Cottage, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins at Dewberry Cottage, a quiet little home tucked away behind overgrown hedges and winding village paths. To most, it seemed peaceful and harmless, the sort of place where nothing truly dreadful could ever happen. Until one evening, the silence inside the cottage was broken by a shocking discovery. The villagers quickly whisper of accidents and unfortunate circumstances, but Miss Marple notices the details others ignore: the untouched teacup on the table, the curtain left slightly open, and the uneasy tension surrounding the cottage long before the tragedy occurred. Because sometimes the smallest homes hide the darkest secrets. Before we uncover what truly happened at Dewberry Cottage, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales.
Chapter 1. The Woman in the Window. Rain drifted lazily over Dewberry Hollow that evening, slow and cold. The sort of rain that turned every garden path into black mud and left the hedges dripping like wet fur. The village lamps glowed through the mist with a weak yellow shimmer, and every cottage along Elder Lane had its curtains drawn tight against the weather. Except one. At the very end of the lane stood Dewberry Cottage, leaning slightly to one side, as though tired from carrying too many years upon its roof. Ivy crawled over the old stone walls, and the tiny garden had long since grown wild. Even in daylight the place looked gloomy. At night it looked abandoned. But it wasn't abandoned. Old Mrs. Agnes Whitmore still lived there alone. People in the village spoke of her in lowered voices, not because she was cruel, no, but because she unsettled them somehow. She rarely left the cottage, rarely smiled, and ever since losing her eyesight years earlier, she'd become almost ghost-like. Some claimed they saw her standing motionless behind the sitting-room curtain late at night, listening to the lane outside, as though waiting for footsteps that never came. Miss Marple had known women like Agnes before. Quiet women, wounded women, women who carried old fears inside them like stones sewn into their pockets. The Thursday it happened began like any other. The postman delivered 2 letters to Dewberry Cottage just after noon. The grocer's boy brought bread and tea at 3:30. At 6 o'clock, Mrs. Ellis from the bakery spotted smoke rising from the chimney and thought nothing more of it. Then the rain came harder. By 8 that evening, the village streets were empty, windows shuttered, doors locked. Only the sound of rainwater trickling through gutters disturbed the silence. And then came the scream. It cut through the storm so sharply that Mr. Pike, the butcher, nearly dropped his bicycle beside the square. One frightened cry, short, sudden, then gone. Not another sound followed it. The villagers peered from behind curtains, but nobody stepped outside. In places like Dewberry Hollow, people preferred not to involve themselves in unpleasantness after dark. By morning, however, curiosity had spread through the village faster than smoke. A crowd gathered outside Dewberry Cottage before breakfast. Constable Harris arrived shortly after 7, a heavy man with wet boots and an irritated expression. He knocked several times at the front door, but no answer came. The curtains inside remained perfectly still. "Perhaps she's asleep," somebody muttered. But Miss Marple, standing quietly beneath her umbrella near the gate, didn't seem convinced. The constable eventually forced the door open. The smell inside struck them first: burnt coal, damp wallpaper, and something bitter underneath it all. The cottage was freezing cold, despite the fire still glowing weakly in the grate. A teacup lay shattered across the carpet. One chair had fallen sideways near the fireplace. And there sat Agnes Whitmore, dead in her armchair. Her gray eyes stared towards the window with a look of terrible fear frozen upon her face. One hand gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The other hung limp beside the chair. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Constable Harris noticed the writing. 3 words smeared unevenly across the fogged sitting-room window. "He knows now." The villagers outside began whispering before the body had even been covered. Some claimed Agnes had enemies. Others swore the cottage was cursed after what happened there years ago. Old rumors crawled out from hiding almost immediately. Rumors about Agnes's late husband, about missing money, about strange arguments once heard through those very walls. But Miss Marple noticed something the others did not. No footprints marked the muddy garden outside the window. No signs of forced entry anywhere in the cottage. And most troubling of all, Agnes Whitmore had been completely blind for nearly 5 years. Miss Marple slowly removed her gloves, glanced once more at the trembling words on the glass, and felt a quiet chill settle into her bones. Because if Agnes hadn't written the message, someone else had.
Chapter 2. Whispers Inside Dewberry Cottage. By the following afternoon, the storm had passed over Dewberry Hollow, but the village still carried that peculiar silence which follows sudden death. Doors opened only halfway. Conversation stopped whenever footsteps approached. Even the church bells sounded dull beneath the heavy gray sky. Dewberry Cottage stood at the end of Elder Lane, exactly as before, crooked, silent, and somehow darker now that Agnes Whitmore was gone. A police ribbon fluttered weakly against the front gate, while curious villagers lingered nearby, pretending not to stare. Miss Marple arrived shortly after midday, carrying a small umbrella and wearing the calm expression she always seemed to possess during unpleasant affairs. Constable Harris greeted her with visible discomfort. He respected Miss Marple, though he disliked how often she noticed things he overlooked. "It's a strange one," he admitted while fumbling with his notebook. "Locked room, no intruder, no clear cause beyond shock." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "People rarely die of fright without a reason, Constable." Inside, the cottage smelled of coal smoke, old books, and damp wallpaper. The sitting room remained untouched since the body had been removed earlier that morning. Agnes's knitting still rested beside the armchair. A pair of spectacles lay folded neatly upon the table, although she'd had no use for them in years. The broken teacup remained scattered across the carpet. Miss Marple crouched carefully beside it. "Has the tea been tested?" she asked. Constable Harris blinked. "Tested? For poison?" "Oh, yes, nothing found." "Interesting." Miss Marple studied the room in silence. Everything appeared ordinary at first glance, yet something about the cottage felt wrong. Not violent wrong, disturbed wrong, like a room someone had searched carefully while pretending not to touch anything. Her eyes drifted slowly across the fireplace, the faded curtains, the photographs lining the mantel. Then she noticed the clock. An old brass mantel clock had stopped at exactly 8:13. "Did anyone wind this clock after the body was discovered?" she asked. "No." "And was it working before?" Constable Harris shrugged. "Suppose so." Miss Marple leaned closer. The glass covering the clock face had cracked very slightly near the edge, not enough to notice immediately, but enough to suggest impact. Perhaps the clock hadn't simply stopped. Perhaps it had been stopped. Meanwhile, whispers had already spread through the village faster than wildfire. By afternoon, half of Dewberry Hollow had invented theories of murder, blackmail, madness, or ghosts. Some villagers claimed Agnes Whitmore had spoken recently of a man returning after many years away. Others remembered old arguments involving her late husband, Edward Whitmore, whose death years earlier itself had been surrounded by unpleasant rumors. Agnes, it seemed, lived with secrets, and secrets rarely stayed buried forever. Miss Marple wandered quietly through the rest of the cottage. The kitchen was spotless. The upstairs bedrooms smelled faintly of lavender and dust. One room remained untouched since Edward Whitmore's death decades earlier. His old coats still hung inside the wardrobe. A walking cane rested beside the bed, exactly where he'd left it. People who preserved rooms like that often preserved guilt as well. Then Miss Marple noticed something odd. A thin trail of muddy water marked the upstairs hallway floorboards, very faint, almost invisible now. Constable Harris frowned when she pointed it out, probably from the officers this morning. "No," said Miss Marple softly, "these prints were made by smaller shoes, narrow heels. A woman's shoes." The trail led directly to Agnes's bedroom and stopped near the wardrobe. Inside hung dresses untouched for years. Beneath them sat an old wooden box locked with a tiny brass clasp. Constable Harris forced it open. Inside were dozens of letters tied carefully with blue ribbon. Most were ordinary enough at first glance: bills, family notes, church notices. But hidden beneath them lay several envelopes bearing the same initials, H.F. Harold Finch. The name caused visible discomfort even in the constable. "Do you know him?" asked Miss Marple. "Only stories," Harris muttered. "Worked as a clerk years ago. Clever fellow. Disappeared after money vanished from several estates nearby. Folks suspected him, but nothing was proved." Miss Marple opened one of the letters carefully. "Agnes, you should have spoken when you had the chance. Now we both live with it." Another letter read only, "If he discovers the truth, neither of us will be safe." No signature, no explanation, only fear soaked into every line. By evening the sky darkened again, and a bitter wind swept through the village lanes. Miss Marple stopped at the bakery before returning home. Mrs. Ellis, flour dusted across her apron, leaned closer the moment Agnes's name was mentioned. "She'd become frightened lately," the woman whispered. "Wouldn't answer the door after sunset. Kept saying someone was watching the cottage." "Did she say who?" Mrs. Ellis hesitated. "Only once, about 2 weeks ago. She said, 'He knows now.' Those exact words." Miss Marple felt a chill settle deep in her chest. The very same words written upon the window when Agnes died. Outside, darkness crept across Dewberry Hollow. Lamps flickered alive behind curtained windows, while the wind rustled through the hedges along Elder Lane. Miss Marple paused before leaving the bakery and glanced toward Dewberry Cottage standing alone at the far end of the lane. And there, at the upstairs window, a figure stood motionless behind the curtain, tall, thin, watching her. Miss Marple stared carefully. Then the curtain shifted and the face vanished into darkness. But the cottage was supposed to be empty.
Chapter 3. The Secret Beneath Dewberry Cottage. Miss Marple stood perfectly still beneath the bakery lamp, her eyes fixed upon the upstairs window of Dewberry Cottage. Rainwater dripped softly from the edge of her umbrella, while the village behind her faded into silence. For several seconds, the figure upstairs did not move. Then the curtain shifted gently, and the face disappeared into darkness. Nobody else on the street had seen it. Mrs. Ellis continued speaking nervously beside the bakery doorway, unaware that someone had just been standing inside a cottage meant to be empty. Miss Marple walked home slowly that evening, though her thoughts moved much faster than her footsteps. Agnes Whitmore had died in terror. A message had appeared upon the window after her death. Old letters spoke of secrets and fear. And now somebody was returning to the cottage during the night. Someone searching for something, or hiding from it. The following morning arrived wrapped in thick white fog. Dewberry Hollow looked almost unreal beneath it. The church tower vanished into mist, and every sound seemed muffled beneath the cold air. Miss Marple found Constable Harris outside Dewberry Cottage once again, stamping warmth into his boots. "There have been more footprints," he said quietly. "Fresh ones this time." The muddy prints led around the side of the cottage toward the back garden. Narrow shoes, deep impressions. Whoever entered the property had come during the night while the ground was still wet from rain. But the prints stopped abruptly beside the old stone wall behind the garden. No prints beyond it, no sign anyone had climbed over. Constable Harris scratched his head with frustration. "It makes no sense." Miss Marple quietly brushed her gloved fingers across the ivy covering the wall. Several vines had been snapped recently, not broken by weather, broken by force. Then she noticed something hidden beneath the leaves, a rusted iron handle. The constable pulled hard upon it, and with a groan of ancient hinges, part of the stone wall shifted inward, a hidden gate. The passage behind it was narrow and overgrown. It led away from the cottage toward the abandoned orchard beyond the lane. Few villagers even remembered the pathway existed anymore, but someone clearly did. The path eventually ended beside an old storage shed, standing crooked among the dead trees. Its wooden door hung slightly open. Constable Harris stepped inside first, then stopped dead. A man sat hunched in the corner beneath a torn blanket, thin, gray-haired, hollow-eyed. He raised one trembling hand against the light, like an animal cornered after years in hiding. Miss Marple recognized the face immediately from the photograph hidden inside Agnes Whitmore's book. Harold Finch. He looked far older than his years. His clothes were ragged. His hands shook constantly, yet his eyes remained sharp with fear. "You should have stayed away," he whispered weakly. "She warned me he'd come back." Constable Harris stepped closer carefully. "Where have you been all these years?" Harold gave a dry laugh that barely sounded human. "Surviving." Back at the cottage, Harold Finch finally spoke after hours of silence beside the fire. His voice cracked often, as though unused for years. Decades earlier, Harold had worked for Edward Whitmore handling legal papers and estate accounts. Edward, it turned out, had been stealing money quietly from wealthy families nearby and blaming the missing funds upon Harold whenever suspicion arose. But Agnes knew the truth. "She saw everything," Harold muttered. "Edward wasn't the charming gentleman people believed. He frightened her, controlled her." One evening, Harold discovered Edward planned to frame him completely and send him to prison. There had been an argument inside Dewberry Cottage, a violent one. Then Edward Whitmore died. Officially, he'd fallen down the cellar stairs after drinking too much whiskey, but that wasn't the truth. Agnes had pushed him. Not from rage, from fear. Harold helped her hide the truth. The village believed Edward's death an accident, while Harold vanished before the stolen money scandal reached him fully. Agnes remained alone inside the cottage ever since, carrying guilt like a stone around her neck. "But why come back now?" asked Constable Harris. Harold's face turned pale. "Because somebody found out." 3 weeks earlier, Harold had received an unsigned letter containing only 4 words: "I know about Edward." Since then, Harold had secretly returned to Dewberry Hollow, searching for Agnes, frightened, desperate, certain someone intended to expose the past. The night Agnes died, Harold admitted he'd gone to the cottage after dark, using the hidden garden path. He saw movement inside before reaching the door. Another visitor had arrived first. Harold never saw the person's face clearly, only a tall figure leaving the sitting room moments before Agnes screamed. "You're lying," Constable Harris snapped. "The windows were bolted from inside." "No," Miss Marple said softly. Both men turned toward her. She walked slowly toward the fireplace, her eyes resting upon the old mantel clock, frozen forever at 8:13. The visitor never escaped through the window, because the visitor never entered that way at all. Miss Marple explained everything calmly. The killer was already inside the cottage before Agnes locked the door for the evening, someone Agnes trusted enough to invite indoors willingly. During their conversation, the visitor revealed knowledge of Edward Whitmore's death and knowledge that Harold Finch was still alive. Agnes panicked. The shock weakened her heart instantly. Then came the final blow. Miss Marple lifted the broken teacup carefully from the evidence table nearby. There was no poison, Miss Marple said, but Agnes's heart medicine had been removed earlier that day. Constable Harris stared silently. Without her medicine, terror itself became deadly. The visitor had known exactly what would happen. "And the message on the window?" he asked. Miss Marple's expression darkened slightly. "A cruel trick, written afterwards to frighten Harold Finch into revealing himself." Silence filled the cottage. Then slowly, painfully, Constable Harris understood. There was never supposed to be a murder investigation. No, only an old woman dying from fright. But one question still remained. Who had visited Agnes Whitmore that night? The answer arrived before sunset. Mrs. Ellis from the bakery confessed everything after collapsing into tears beside her kitchen table. Years earlier, her late husband had lost nearly everything because of Edward Whitmore's stolen schemes. She'd spent decades believing Harold Finch responsible, until recently discovering letters proving the truth. She confronted Agnes privately that evening at the cottage. "She admitted it all," Mrs. Ellis sobbed. "She said she'd protected herself all these years while innocent people suffered." The argument became worse. Agnes reached desperately for her medicine, but in anger, Mrs. Ellis had already hidden the bottle before speaking with her. "I only wanted to frighten her," she cried. "I never meant for her to die." The room fell silent except for her weeping. Outside, evening settled slowly over Dewberry Hollow. The fog had finally begun to clear, and warm light glowed once more behind cottage windows along Elder Lane. Days later, Dewberry Cottage stood empty at last. Its curtains remained open now, allowing sunlight into rooms that had hidden secrets for too long. But villagers still lowered their voices after passing the cottage after dark, because some claimed they occasionally saw movement upstairs near the window. A pale figure standing silently behind the curtain, watching the lane below. Perhaps memory lingers in old houses, or perhaps guilt never leaves them. And somewhere beyond the village lanes, Miss Marple walked quietly home beneath the fading evening sky,
already wondering what terrible secret another harmless little village might be hiding next. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and step carefully before trusting quiet villages. They always hide something in the dark.